Hello everyone. Railway company magazines are one of the traditional sources for family history research. Much like newspapers, they report on lifetime events such as retirements, deaths, and if you're lucky, promotions and appointments. People set out to research in them though with a singular focus, a name, a date, a place, and possibly don't think about the context of the magazine and what else it's telling us. Before I go further, where can you find these magazines? In my search, I found little mention of online copies. The larger physical runs are held at either the National Archives or the National Railway Museum, as you would expect. But I did find some gaps, and individual railway societies may have their own holdings, which are available to their members. And I also found individual copies, originals and reprints offered on such as eBay, eBooks and the like. Now I'm going to use the LNWR Gazette as my example purely because I have online access to it as a society member and volunteer. And I'm just going to share my screen so that it's loaded and ready. That's that done. So the different companies started their magazines at different times, of course. So when looking at them as a whole, you need to pick your period. In this case, the LNWR Gazette began in 1912 and lasted for 10 years. It's that interesting period encompassing the First World War and some of the first steps in female emancipation, war work and the vote. It's also conveniently between the last two census releases that we're going to have for a very long time. The 1921 census report tells us that the railways at that time were the fifth largest employer of males, but that females only made up 3% of the industry. I did wonder how much this would be reflected in the staff magazine, but for this period, largely dominated by war news as it is difficult to tell. There was a woman's page, although the first one ever written was by a male, and he did admit to it. As time went on, it found its voice, and under the innocuous heading Tea Table Topics, it published their vaguely titled pieces, which could easily be called feminist editorials, on various issues of the day that it thought would be interesting to women, presumably. The original magazine was the premier Railway Athletic Gazette, the official organ of the London and Northwestern London Athletic Club. It cost twopence and was published quarterly. It was a sporting magazine, but enlarged in subsequent issues to cover all recreative pursuits, and was published and also to cover more than just London, nationally, in fact. They had a cartoonist on the staff. The cover of that one is a train festooned with sportsmen, and the magazine, cringingly, was known as the RAG. Most of the bound volumes held by the LNWRS, apart from one duplicate for 1912-13, have had their adverts and covers removed, which is a bit of a shame, as I find them rather interesting. There's an advert for a sort of typewriter comptometer, which I'd never come across before, for instance. And they had life insurance ads, accident and disease policy ads for overcoats, gentlemen's tailors, coal, beer, whiskey, correspondence courses, and for holiday apartments, hotels and boarding houses. And these were in Douglas, Isle of Man, Colwyn Bay, Blackpool, Llandudno and Rhyl, which is obviously where railway staff went on holiday. In the later, more formal editions, we start to see ads for engineering products, nuts and bolts, mechanical lubricators, and rolling stock. And for luxury travel on the express train services. These were from Euston to Birmingham and points north. And these had breakfast, luncheon and dining cars on the principal trains. and they advertised the railway company hotels with their names, with where they were rather. And these are accompanied by more humble adverts for Horlicks, life assurance, beehives. Probably the beehives are in response to a regular column in this first year or so about beekeeping. The first volume, as I said, covers 2 years, as at that time it was issued quarterly. By issue 4 in October 1912, the format had changed along with the name. No more jokey covers, but a black and white photo of a train accompanying picturesque steam. Now, the mag is still the RAG, but this now stands for the London and North Western Recreative Association's Gazette. Much more formal, and the magazine had changed to, in character certainly, management of some kind had muscled in, made it a bit more corporate. One good thing, though, was that the price dropped to just 1 penny, and it was to be on sale at any station which wished to put in an order. Now, I'm just going to stop a minute because I've been showing you various articles from the 1916 volume. The Gazette itself was digitized very early on in the LNWR Society's digitization program, way before it got a decent scanner. So these are all done on flatbed scanner, page by page. So the images aren't as good as we would have liked, and the whole thing will need rescanning at some point to correct the out of order pages, the bits where check whether we are actually missing pages, etc. It exists in 2 forms. We've got the original scans stitched together and housed on the digital management system. We need a snappy name for that, really. And one converted into flipbooks, which have the advantage of being very quick to load. In the interest of time, I'm only going to feature 1916, and I'm using the flipbooks, as you can see. Now, I mentioned tea table topics before. In these early days, they're very definitely feminist in nature, with titles such as "Should Wives Have Wages?" Oh, the bookmarks are being a pain, sorry. Right, okay. And "Why Am I a Suffragette?" and things like "Girls in Business." There are pieces about ambulance examinations. Ambulance training is very much a feature of these magazines throughout the years, not just to respond to railway accidents, such as the ones Mike Esbester will tell us about later, but as the forerunner for sending out ambulance services to the coming war. And there's another piece about first aid boxes on passenger trains. There are block telegraph signalling instruction classes, an intriguing article entitled "Across the Channel" in an outrigged 8, which I think is about rowing. About station prizes on the Caledonian Railway, which David Turner might prick up his ears at. About football teams, clerical staff, mechanics institutes, cooperative societies, temperance unions and horticultural societies, horse parades, fire brigade displays, a water carnival in the Antipodes, and perhaps not meant as such, but in hindsight more than a little foreboding, a piece about territorial manoeuvres in East Anglia. I'll have another go at these bookmarks. They were working fine. Oh, good, it's working. Thank you. So how about 1914? The issues in 1914 continue much as normal, as you'd expect, until the outbreak of war, with very little hint of what the magazine is going to turn into. There's an article on that adding and subtracting typewriter we saw advertised. A piece about railway models, in this case, a modern model goods station, and about Curzon Street's prize male voice choir. Electrification is very much a theme, railway electrification for a start, and about an electric power station at Stanbridge Park, which I think is actually Stonebridge Park. There's a piece on the new ambulance trains with photos and the proud boast of how quickly they produce them. There's a mention of the Foreign Legion. There are still the little pieces of biographical information, but nowhere as many as there will be from 1916 onwards. And in the November issue, there's the very first Roll of Honour, with details of those killed in action, those died of wounds, wounded and sick, and prisoner of war, and organised by department, usually. And there's a bit of a word of warning here. These were often updated in subsequent issues. For instance, if the wounded person died or the missing were found. So if you find a name here and are not actually definitely dead, check for later issues. In 1915, the war is ever present. Flowers for the Manchester Military Hospital, the Tobacco Fund, aimed at keeping men at the front in tobacco, and other fundraising efforts for the war abound. Everyone's doing their bit, and there are items about the railwaymen with the Royal Engineers, about Northwestern entertainment at the front, letters from the men at the front as well, those mentioned in dispatches, gallantry awards, that kind of thing, and the Roll of Honour in every issue, plus what everyone in the different areas were doing for the war effort. There are news items such as about the derailment of the Irish Mail and improvements at both Euston, and this one's got plans and drawings, and Nuneaton. And social lives still went on with the Operatic Society in full flow. 1916, the war's beginning to bite. And here, as I talk, I'm going to actually start looking at the events at night on 1916 from August 9, which is be the first time that the news of the Somme would have been coming out. So it starts at the August issue is image 224, and I'm just going to page through as I'm talking, and I'll continue paging through as I get through to 1921, just so that you can look at it. You can either listen to me or you can look at it, or if you're good at it, you can do both. So 1916, the war's beginning to bite. Conscription has come in. The articles are still pretty upbeat in the beginning. They've got celebrations of the individual acts of bravery, a fighting railway family, which I think we saw earlier, with many sons out at the front. There's articles on Northwestern steamers and the war, coal for the North Sea Fleet, which contrasts with pieces on things like Willesden Junction's Jubilee celebrations, which is something that ran and ran. Tea table topics under things like realisation and a creche day remind us that they're slowly realising that the war's going to last. And just the innocuous piece on the staff creche reminds us that women are now needing creche facilities in order to be able to work to replace the men that are lost. And of course, we have the news items, the travelling post office we saw earlier, electrical cooking at Euston, and information on the new technology now available. For instance, there's an article on modern railway office equipment extolling the marvels of the dictaphone, with photos of the men doing the dictating, and the typewriting rooms with their rows of women and machines, a typing pool basically. And in staff and general news, we have a mixture of war and home front items about individuals. Here you can see this is 1916. That's probably the aftermath of the Somme. In 1917, if the Gazette is anything to go by, it was very somber. Food rationing was in force. The paper shortage had hit. And in order for the magazine to continue, the price had gone up to twopence halfpenny. and it definitely encouraged people to buy a copy, read it, and send it on to the men at the front, who were eagerly awaiting it, apparently. It was the second year of conscription. Britain was beginning to run out of men to send to war. America had not quite decided to send its men along, certainly at the beginning of the year. There's articles such as that on homes for permanently wounded men, and it seems to acknowledge the impact of the war on those who were wounded. And according to the Board of Trade, up to April 1917, 1.2 million women had been added to those working in important industries, which was a 37% increase, apparently. There begins to be a recognition of the women at work with photos of them. There's photos of the women who worked in a clerical capacity in the goods department at Coventry, and photos of the female workshop staff in the wagon department at Earlstown. By 1918, there's a feeling of war weariness, despite the fact that America has entered the war. Rationing is still in force. It and food hoarding are the subjects of tea table topics, along with voluntary meatless days. And they also talk about women working on the land. You've got the rolls of honour, the gallantry awards, the news of the staff at the front, and articles to do with the soldiers, but peripherally things like the motor transport volunteers at stations who volunteered to help weary soldiers at stations. You've got articles such as life on an ambulance train. And we see wedding photos of servicemen in their uniforms home on leave to get married. And also the opening of a specific government information bureau at Euston to help the public with the myriad rules and regulations in force. And there is a harking back to the past. An article on Queen Victoria's railway journeys and one on links with the coaching age. At the beginning of 1919, the roll of honour is still a feature for some months, and memorial services are being held amid thoughts of more memorials, such as the one proposed at Euston. But life was getting back to normal, with horticultural shows and allotment notes. There's still mentions of the war with articles on armoured trains and steamers on war service, but thoughts are ranging abroad with an article on the Jaffa to Jerusalem line, on the train used by the Prince of Wales in Canada, and about President Wilson's visit to Carlisle. There's articles on the James Watt centenary, and there's a new steamer on the cross-channel service. And there's also now a regular story written by a mysterious gentleman, presumably, called H. There's also the appearance of deaths of staff from double pneumonia after contracting influenza, looking much like Spanish flu. These do. One young lady member of the clerical staff who died on the eve of her 17th birthday wouldn't normally be a flu victim. And Tea Table Topics deals with the issue of female emigration, war brides basically, swept off their feet by foreign soldiers setting up home in the Dominions. (1920) saw the addition of poetry to the magazine, with 2 poems, Demobilized and The Signalman and His Pig. The Operatic and Dramatic Society was back in force, as was the Athletic Club, and There are mentions of the various welfare societies. Not too old at 72 is obviously a retirement, and there's an article on railway gardeners that I found. The company has a new ship to replace the old Anglia, which was sunk in 1915 when it was acting as a hospital ship. And there's a feature on pilfering entitled Railway Robbery. But there is still war items. So the unveiling of a memorial tablet at Morrow, war relief works at Wolverton, peace work at Crewe, and of course the welcome home dinners for returning servicemen. There's now a children's section called Candle Time with a bedtime story and accounts of the production of Merry England by the Operatic and Dramatic Society and of the Temperance Union Eisteddfod. (1921) is the year of the War Memorial, with a roll of honour in the library at Euston, war memorials in the locomotive departments at Crewe and at Longsight, and unveiling ceremonies at Rugby Engine Shed, Broad Street and Garston Docks, to name but a few, alongside signs of normality such as articles on poultry keeping, the Ditton Railway Institute, the Blackpool Athletic Festival, and a gala at Stonebridge Park Power Station. There's a station garden competition, of course, and mention of the welfare organisations, as per usual, the Provident and Pension Society and the Widows and Orphans. Ambulance notes begins with common errors in first aid. And there seems to be a spate of retirements, as probably those who held on over the war can go now. So that's just a whistle stop through 10 years of magazines over a wide range of topics, and that's just a tiny selection of what's in there. The magazines started in a jolly way in 1912 as an athletic club idea to be taken over as a much wider and more official thing. And they began to find their feet in 1913, only for the outbreak of war in the middle of 1914 to change everything. War overtook everything, it seems, even into 1921, when the war memorials, which had been long in the planning, began to be unveiled, and everyone began to fully realise the scale of the losses. Women, possibly reluctantly, went back into the home with the promise of the vote for all of them in 1928. The future of the railway company itself was uncertain, and industrial unrest was on the horizon, in all industries actually. The company would not exist in 5 years' time, except as part of the London, Midland and Scottish. Change was on its way. Thank you.